As was mentioned, actually, I was supposed to speak at the next session on perspectives on debt restructuring, but Avinash is, I think, just got off a flight 2 hours back and therefore wanted to speak in the afternoon. Therefore, I'm here in this session. Okay, what I want to look at really is something which is noticed but not so discussed often, and which is that recent efforts at resolving debt crisis, which essentially take the form of default either on interest payments or amortization payments on external debt by countries like Sri Lanka, Ghana, Zambia, Ecuador, and so on and so forth, that these are fundamentally external debt crises, but the restructuring debate on the external debt crisis has included a discussion on the need to restructure domestic debt, and two countries in particular, Sri Lanka and Ghana, have actually implemented some form of debt restructuring, which is domestic debt restructuring. And the whole idea is that this appears paradoxical because of the fact that what you're trying to actually deal with is an external debt crisis and not really a domestic debt crisis, which is borrowing by the sovereign in domestic currency. Now, if we go back to looking at even though the IMF finally says that this is a decision which is taken by these governments at the point of time when they decide to restructure in the context of an external debt crisis, the fact of the matter is that this is something which has been pushed by the IMF for some time now, particularly starting around 2021. And the argument essentially was that the way in which we should look at debt is, or the difference between external and domestic debt, is not that external debt is essentially debt which is incurred in foreign currency substantially to non-resident holders of the debt instruments, whereas domestic debt is debt which is incurred in domestic currency by largely, predominantly domestic holders of government bonds of various kinds. That the distinction which is made by the IMF is that the distinction between external debt or foreign debt and domestic debt is that one falls under foreign law, which I suppose in the case of bonds essentially is New York or London law, and the other falls under domestic law. So the whole distinction is not even on the basis of the residence of the holder. It's definitely not on the basis of what we thought was the obvious way and was always the way in which external debt crises were discussed, or the difference between domestic and external debt was discussed, but which is in terms of the currency of the debt, but it is in terms of which kind of law are the instruments involved subject to. Now, this obviously ignores some kind of actual difference which exists between the two, because it's not just which currency. Implicit in looking at which currency is looking at what are the prime drivers of these two kinds of debt. And one kind of debt, which is domestic debt, is a debt we know, which essentially means that if there is an excess of expenditures which a state has to sustain in a particular period, which it can't immediately or chooses not to immediately deal with or address by additional taxation or other forms of resource mobilization, that it decides to borrow, and it borrows in its domestic currency, which is fair enough. And the reason it's able to do that is because of the fact that the belief is that the expenditures very often undertaken on the basis of this kind of debt-financed in spending result in increases in output, which given a certain tax GDP ratio would result in increases in tax revenues, and those increases in tax revenues can be used to partly meet the debt service requirements of the additional debt in terms of amortization payments and interest payments. The other, of course, is the fact that in any case, the sovereign always has the right to tax additionally, to think of new taxes, to change the rates of taxation, etc. So it's possible for, as long as the debt is in domestic currency, which doesn't have to be transformed into international currency, it can decide in future to impose taxes in order to mobilize the resources to be able to cover its domestic debt. But this, of course, is not something which is true about foreign currency borrowing, because while it is the case that some governments do tend to borrow abroad, particularly when interest rates are low, etc., to finance budgetary expenditures, the principal reason why you get into a significant amount of external debt is because of the fact that you need that finance. You need that finance to cover deficits in the current account of your balance of payments. So long as you happen to be inadequately diversified structurally in order to be able to earn the foreign exchange through imports or otherwise, to finance, through exports or otherwise, to finance your imports, you end up in the situation where you have current account deficits, and those deficits have to be financed. And one of the ways in which you do it is essentially by going in for borrowing, to the extent that the other way in which it could be financed, which is foreign direct investment flows, are completely determined from the supply side. They're not really determined on the basis of you picking up a telephone and calling New York and saying, please come and invest $100 billion or $10 billion in my country. So basically, a foreign currency debt crisis arises because of inadequate liquidity in foreign currency terms, and therefore handling such a crisis requires, as is the case now, to either reduce the volume of debt by actually saying that this debt is unsustainable, which essentially means some kind of haircut, not just debt relief or debt forgiveness, but a haircut, because of the fact that many of these lenders have in any case recouped a significant amount of what they provided. But really, you cannot actually deal with that kind of a liquidity problem by resorting to domestic debt restructuring, which, even assuming that it releases a certain amount of resources because of the state now having to deal with less amount of domestic debt, you cannot translate that additional resources into foreign currency in order to be able to service this debt. So why do we have domestic debt restructuring discussed in a context in which you're actually confronted with an external debt crisis? Now, the other issue here, of course, is that it's not merely what I'm speaking of, but you also have to look at the kind of counterparties that are being dealt with when we deal with domestic and foreign restructuring. When you deal with domestic restructuring, you're dealing with entities over which the state has substantial degree of influence. You're dealing with entities like commercial banks, pension funds, mutual funds, etc. Whereas when you're dealing with external debt, you're actually dealing with extremely powerful players, including, of course, the multilateral development banks. Besides, of course, the bilateral creditors who have power, which comes from the fact that they're powerful states. But it does mean that you're dealing with a set of players like bondholders, commercial banks, international commercial banks, etc., who are powerful players. So you're not merely talking about a restructuring process which is on par, given the kind of counterparties that you're dealing with in this process. Okay. So the thing is, not surprisingly, therefore, if you actually look at history, and I'm just using the IMF's own data here from its 2021 case for DDR, which is that out of 171 restructurings it identified over the period, using other people's data, of course, over the period from, for about 21 years, from 1980 to 2020, only 63 had any component of DDR in it, and only 37 were pure DDR exercises. But more importantly, when DDR, the domestic debt restructuring occurred, it occurred in the poorest of countries, which actually pointed to the fact that it was something else, not really the fact that you needed to release resources, but it was some other reason why these countries needed to restructure their domestic debt and therefore go in for a pure DDR exercise, let alone a DDR exercise linked to external debt restructuring. Further, if you look at the real, well, let's say, the modern day debt crises in developing countries, which happened after the rise to dominance of international finance, which started with, of course, with the Mexican debt crisis or the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s, starting in 1982, and subsequently, that all of that was focused on restructuring debt. I mean, the Brady Plan was not focused on trying to restructure domestic debt in these countries. It was focused on restructuring international debt. So you really have very, very little historical evidence that domestic debt restructuring has been an important way of addressing debt stress in countries. You really needed to address debt stress through a restructuring exercise, normally in a context of an external debt crisis. Now, the IMF, of course, has an explanation of why this is the case. Why was it that in the past you didn't have too much DDR? And they say that that was because of the fact that you inflated your way out of debt, that countries basically tried to use a combination of financial repression, which presumably means that you kept your interest rates low and therefore you never got into a domestic debt crisis because you actually suppressed interest rates, or you ended up with a situation where high inflation reduced the real value of debt. And because it reduced the real value of debt, that debt wasn't very important. Not very clear, because inflation affects the denominator and the GDP ratio as well. So you're basically saying that, that, okay, there's an increase in GDP, which can come with inflation, and that also would would essentially get rid of the level of the debt GDP ratio, and therefore that's why you're not very much bothered about it. Now, therefore, the IMF's argument is that once emerging markets and developing economies, as they call the low and middle income countries, liberalized their financial systems and moved into more rational financial and monetary policy, including, of course, inflation targeting, which kept down interest rates in those countries ostensibly, you ended up not being able to actually get rid of your debt through those kinds of mechanisms. You actually had to find other ways of addressing your domestic debt, because you couldn't just wipe out the value or keep it low by keeping interest rates low, and therefore DDR became more common. Now, as I said, there are a number of problems with this view. One, of course, reference to financial repression seems to suggest that low interest rates stall the potential debt crisis, whereas we know that in many developing countries, even after taking into account inflation, which is looking at the real rates of interest, they can be pretty high during different periods of time. So it's not true that financial repression actually worked in the way it's claimed it worked. Reducing real value of debt does not preclude accumulation of additional nominal debt in domestic currency. There seems to be no threshold at which domestic debt becomes unsustainable. Even looking at this data, the pre-restructuring median level of public debt relative to GDP was about 70%. I mean, 70% debt to GDP ratios, some might say it's high, depends upon where you're coming from, but it need not necessarily be something which is alarmingly high to warrant you going in for a domestic debt restructuring. And as I said, that most of these debt restructuring occur in low-income countries or in small states, pointing to the fact that other factors explain it. Now, in the debt crisis phase, when as a result of I'm not going to go into the details of a supply-side push of capital into developing countries, as a result of large amounts of excess liquidity in the international financial system, particularly the commercial banks, that was a period in which you really did not hear much discussion about DDR, because of the fact that, as I said, in the 1980s debt crisis, you didn't hear discussions about domestic debt. You really focused on external debt restructuring. That's the kind of crisis that you're faced with now. So the problem with this package is that it ignores the difference between domestic and external debt. Even if domestic debt restructuring releases resources, there's no reason why it can be automatically transformed. We'll have to look at that in a minute. Restructuring of domestic debt actually tends to affect the weaker counterparties that you have as far as the domestic economy is concerned. It affects the commercial banks, which affects credit provision, which can have deflationary consequences in the domestic economy. It affects pension funds. Therefore, it affects the savings of ordinary citizens, tea plantation workers, as Aileen has pointed out in Sri Lanka. And it actually results can result in a situation where if banks become insolvent, and you think of a strategy of dealing with that problem just as much as you're talking about domestic debt restructuring through some kind of a bail-in of the banks where depositors take part of the haircut, then it can affect ordinary depositors as well. So you're really talking about putting harm on a significant section of a population which directly or even indirectly is not responsible for the accumulation of this large volume of external debt. And besides these destabilizing consequences, and which is what I'll end with, it's extremely difficult to generate equal treatment among domestic debtors. So we know, for example, that if you look at Sri Lanka, in Sri Lanka's case, it was the pension funds, the banks were left out of it because the Central Bank of Sri Lanka decided that if it actually gets the domestic banks to take a haircut on the debt of the sovereign debt they held, then they would actually become insolvent, which would mean that you'll have to recapitalize them, which means that the state, which is reducing its debt, will now have to borrow in order to be able to recapitalize the banks. So it would be self-defeating. And so it put a lot of the burden onto the pension funds. But if you go to Ghana, pension funds opposed it, unions opposed it, because that became an issue, possibly because it was also nearing election time. You ended up with a situation where pension funds were given a deal, a sweetened deal, where actually they didn't take a haircut at all. All what happened is the immediate payments which the sovereign had to make were reduced as part of a restructuring of debt with the pension funds. But if you look at the debt, what they did with the commercial banks, the commercial banks, which after the banking crisis in Ghana of 2017 to 2020 had just been recapitalized, were told to take a significant cut in their in their in the volume of debt that they held. They had to accept a significant haircut. Now, the question is, so therefore what you're saying is, that if at all you think that comparability of treatment is some kind of a principle which must hold in debt restructuring, when it comes to domestic debt, there's no question of comparability of treatment, because it depends upon how those weak counterparties are able to carry the burden of this adjustment process. So it varies across countries, it varies for political reasons, and so on and so forth. Now, this raises the question, why exactly are they doing this? Why this emphasis, so much emphasis now, increasing emphasis on domestic debt? In fact, you're forced to do it even before the IMF gives you a staff level agreement, forget a board sanction, for a small amount of money relative to the volume of external debt that you would hold. Well, one reason could be, you can say that austerity releases from domestic consumption a set of real resources which can then be exported to earn the foreign exchange to meet your external debt payments if you're faced with a situation where you're not able to make your external. So there is a way in which you can transform domestic into foreign resources. Now, firstly, this would mean huge austerity. Even in a country like Greece, we know, where it's the same currency. They didn't borrow in foreign currency. Of course, it was not their central bank issuing the currency, but they didn't borrow in a foreign currency because they were part of the Eurozone. You had to take huge austerity in order to be able to generate resources. But the other thing is that you're assuming that there's full capacity in segments in segments of the economy which can release these resources. Because if there isn't full capacity utilization, then you would have been able to export those resources even without actually releasing them through austerity. So that really isn't the argument. The second would be that austerity could contract GDP, which, given any level of import intensity of domestic consumption and production, a contraction in GDP would essentially mean a contraction in imports, and therefore you save foreign exchange because you're not going to touch the pool of foreign exchange earnings to finance that bit of import which gets squeezed as a result of a reduction in your GDP, and that allows you to generate the foreign exchange in order to be able to pay. That's a possibility. That's one reason why maybe you want to try and experiment with this, but the kind of, as I said, if you just look at the numbers of the Greek case, the kind of austerity that would be needed to generate adequate resources through these means in order to pay off your foreign debt would be so large that it would be completely devastating for the economy. Now, the third could be that you really want to impose this austerity because of the fact that you want to sort of use it to balance the degree to which you impose a haircut on external creditors. We know multilateral development banks take no haircut because they lose their AAA ratings. Private creditors don't want to take too much of a haircut, and therefore they keep stalling. We know that in all of these countries, DDR has not led to resolving the problem. Neither in Sri Lanka nor in Ghana has a situation arisen where you actually have been able to resolve your external debt restructuring, because still you're negotiating, or at least in Sri Lanka's case, the last set of negotiations just broke down. You're still negotiating with external creditors, so it's not resolving that problem. But maybe the idea is that if you impose these kinds of haircuts, if you impose this kind of austerity, you can convince that there would be a release of resources which can be used for ensuring that the level of haircut which an external creditor has to suffer is less. And that could be the real reason. Now, the one thing I want to point to here is that what one is saying is not just speculation. Let's look at the Ghanaian case now. Already in Ghana, because the debt restructuring for commercial banks happened in December 2022. Already in Ghana, the estimate from one source is that the net present value losses on domestic sovereign debt with the commercial banks is going to be some 41 billion cedis, Ghanaian cedis, which is supposed to be enough to render a number of these banks insolvent. So therefore, the government has set up a Ghana Financial Stability Fund, a $1.2 billion fund, in order to be able to support the banks, instead of actually taking it from the budget, because that would mean it's counterproductive. But what you have is how are you going to fund this 1.2 billion? And the way it's going to be funded is you borrow from the World Bank and the international financial institutions to create a fund to support the banks that you're actually running down because of the fact that you're doing domestic debt restructuring. You borrow abroad from multinational institutions, which will never take a haircut in order to be able to deal with this crisis. So to conclude, I'd say that the only way we can explain this, the only way we can explain why DDR has become so important is that this is a way in which you actually deflect attention from what is the fundamental problem, which is the inequality which results in chronic balance of payments problems and therefore a huge amount of accumulated debt and debt in the hands of those who are unwilling to take haircuts in order to resolve that debt in a way which is sustainable. Thank you.